Welcome back to Cards and Comics, guys. Today I want to talk about pricing of SGC cards versus PSA. And the fact is that they are catching up to PSA on pricing. And I'm talking really vintage cards here. So back in 2022, I did an analysis of pricing between SGC and PSA for every 1960s Hall of Fame rookie card in various grades. And in there, I saw that the pricing was somewhat close, but there was still, I consider, a pretty big gap. I mean, 15, 20%. That gap was closing on some grades, and it's pretty consistent. So I want to go through the data with you because I kind of have, I have a 2022 data set and a 2024 data set. I have a template, so it's easy for me to redo this analysis. So here we go. We'll go right into it so you guys can see what I'm talking about. And the good thing about this data analysis, I'm also able to look at the value loss of PSA and SGC cards over the last 2 years. So let's get right into it. All right, so here's the data from 2022. And just want to point out a few things here. Is it's all the 60s Hall of Famers. And you'll notice that SGC has some gaps in their data, meaning that there was no copies of certain cards sold during the time period I was looking for in 2022. So it's hard to compare some data because there's some gaps. And the big thing here, when I get to the summary, is that you'll see, or I'll show you the summary page here, that there was a clear difference in pricing at the different levels, but that the SGC to PSA gap was pretty consistent. So if I move on to slide 2, which is the 2024 data analysis, you'll see that the gaps are much smaller. There's not as many missing data points. So that right off the bat shows that two things are happening. One is that there's more cards, in my opinion, being graded in the 6, 7, and 8 grades because my analysis was in the 6, 7, and 8 grade. Those cards are becoming more available for sale. So we're seeing a higher volume of SGC cards being sold at these grades, which is good for SGC because availability is an issue. If you don't have the cards available to sell, it's really hard to say that you're in the game, right? You have to have cards available for sale before you can say you're comparable. If you can't even find an SGC 8, not because they're so, let's say, so valuable that everyone's buying them. It's just that there's not enough of them been graded because everyone grades high-end cards to PSA. And I think that's what we were seeing up until probably the last 2 years is a lot of high-end cards were just going to PSA directly. In fact, I was listening to the Jeff Wilson podcast where he's talking to a local dealer, and he says he always recommends to his customers to grade any card 7 that could grade 7 or above in vintage to go with PSA because of the value difference between those cards. And I think that is what you were seeing prior to 2022, 22 and before. I think we're seeing more cards graded by SGC in some of these higher grades, especially 6, 7, and 8. Now, I mentioned the gap here where in 2022, there was 15 total cards that were missing from the data set, and a majority of them were in the PSA 8 grade. 10 of the 15 were 8s. Now, in the new data set in 2024, there's only one card missing, and it's an 8, but that's much better than 2022. Now, however, just as a caveat, 7 of the cards in SGC 8 grade only had one sale in the entire year of 2024. So while it's improving, it could be better because for the most part, the way I did my analysis is I took the last 10 sold copies and did an average price. Some cases for SGC, like in 6s and 7s, I had 7 to 10 data points for almost every card. For 8s and above, there was quite a few cards that had 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 copies sold in the entire 2024 data set, just showing that there's still some room to grow for SGC and availability in those grades because you need more people to submit the high grade cards, so there's more cards to sell and to compare prices like I'm doing. So let's get into this whole thing. Take away my head here so you can see it better. So here it is. what happened between 2022 and 2024. So let's start with the 6th grade. So in 2022, there was about a 16.5% difference between an 6 PSA card and a 6 SGC card. In 2024, there's basically a 6% difference. So you went from 16 and a half to 6. It's a 10-point gain for SGC on PSA. And Chris Sewell, on his recent video, he mentioned the same thing, that in that PSA SGC 6 price point, there is really very little difference now between PSA and SGC. So that is a huge difference, in my opinion, that 10% gain. And you look at just total pricing, it's, in total money, in total dollars, the average is $24 now between an average PSA 6 Hall of Famer from the 60s and an average SGC. So we're talking $24 difference between every card on average. That's much different than the $82 we had in 2022. So that just shows you that that gap is narrowing and it's very consistent. In fact, if I go back to the data set here, you can see that everything I have highlighted in black are cards that SGC actually outsold PSA on average. You have a lot of black in that PSA or 6th grade. You have a little bit of black in 7 and a little bit of black in 8, but the 6, there's quite a few. There's a lot of cards that outsold PSA in that 6th grade, which means to me, again, that if you have a card that grades in that 6th range, it doesn't matter if it's PSA or SGC on average anymore. It's really close. That gap is really, really tightened. Now let's look at the 7th grade. The difference isn't quite as stark. In 2022, it was 87% difference or a 13% gap. Now it's about 11. So we gained about 2 points. Not as significant as we saw in 2022 in terms, or sorry, as the 6th grade. Not as dramatic, but it does show that the gap is narrowing and it didn't go down. So what I'm going to say here is that, and just like Chris Sewell said in his video, was if you have a 6 or a 7, and I think if I did the analysis on 5, 4s, and 3s, it would show me the same thing, that price gap is lower. And then you take into account the grading price differences and your time to get your cards back, that is very attractive now for someone with vintage cards. Because basically what I want to tell you is when we get to this 8th grade, the gap did widen. And I'll give you some reasons why I think that happened. But really, if you are grading vintage cards, unless you're very convinced your card's going to grade a PSA 8 or above, which is very difficult for a lot of vintage cards, you might be better off grading in the SGC right now. Not just because of the service, not be because of the tuxedo holder, and not be because the turnaround time is better or the price is cheaper. It's because the value gap is much tighter than it was a couple years ago. Yeah, it's 2 points on the 7, but again, if you go back to my to my original data set here, there are black cards that did sell on average higher. So again, it's not as starkly one-sided, where in 2022, a majority of the data, if you go to 2022, you do not see much black. You see basically one card in 6, one card in 7, and then I think one card in 8 that sold higher than PSA for SGC. You go to 2024 data and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 cards that outsold PSA in just one grade. That's not just like 1 or 2 data points. That's sort of a trend. So it just shows you, like, if you really don't think your card's going to be a slam dunk 8, should you be grading an SGC? And we've all been complaining about the service levels and the other things, and now PSA's backlogged. Everything is really lining up for SGC. The values are getting, gap is getting closer. The turnaround times are still sticking and still really good. Their pricing model is better than PSA. Again, the only thing I can say is that, unless it's an 8 or above, there's not a lot of reason to go to PSA right now on vintage cards unless that's a super high-end card. Now, why do I think this PSA 8 gap exists? Why did it widen? I think for two reasons. One is the set registry. Still a big deal. A lot of these high-end cards, and again, I did 60s Hall of Fame rookie cards. That is a registry in amongst itself. Okay. Hall of Fame registry, very competitive. The fact is that if you're a player collector, the Hall of Fame rookie card is generally your best card of that player. So the guys who are, collecting, set registry collecting, that's your most valuable and highest ranked card in your set. You want it in as high a grade as possible. So the eights are very competitive in terms of pricing. So that registry does add a tremendous amount of value for certain cards. And the other thing too is, and I'm going to just say this because, this idea that PSA is not grading harder than it used to, I think we're all in alignment across everyone I've really talked to that does this either for a living or just does tons of grading. PSA's standards have changed. And I do think if you're going to spend $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 on a card, if you get that PSA 8, especially, now, newly graded, there is this big perception that that card is graded much stricter than SGC in that 8 grade. Now, you can argue with me all you want that the SGC 8s are just as good as PSA. It's perception by the person buying it. The person buying that card a lot of times is a registry guy or someone looking for very high end, willing to pay that higher price. And so the perception now with PSA is that 8s and 9s are super tough and hard to get. So that card is going to be graded really strictly. So that's really the two things I can really think of is it's, the registry plus this idea that PSA is very restrictive now on 8s and 9s for vintage cards. And so those cards should be worth a lot more. So we'll see if SGC closes that gap. This is just a visual representation of 8s, 7s, and 6s. So the 8 on top is, SGC lost ground on 8s. It gained ground on 7s and 6s. You can see 2.3% for a 7 and 10.4% for a 6. But it lost 6 points on the 8. And again, I think the registry and just the perception of the hardness of PSA's new standards, which they won't admit they have new standards, but everyone is kind of saying that PSA is really hard at that top end right now. Now, let's talk about value loss. So, we've established the fact that if you grade with SGC now, unless you get 8s or 9s, your value difference between PSA and SGC is a lot closer. In 6 and below, it's pretty much non-existent. You're going to get almost the same price, especially if the card is well centered. Again, in vintage cards, they can vary quite a bit in terms of centering and eye appeal. So a high-end eye appeal SGC card will outsell a low-end eye appeal card a lot of times in PSA holders. We see that all the time. If you look at if you look at auctions, or if you look at VCP and just see why did that card bring $400 more than the PSA card? Oh, it's perfectly centered. Okay. And that last PSA card was way off center. Oh, makes sense. That happens quite a bit. And so you have to look at it like this. If you have a well-centered card that grades SGC 6, chances are you're going to sell exactly the same as PSA or even higher. So that is good news for SGC fans. And, like I said, there's a lot of great reasons to grade with SGC right now. Now, let's look at the value loss from 2022 to 24. This is kind of a bonus. I was able just to kind of mine this data as I was putting my data set together. So How much have we lost in the last 2 years? Well, if you put together the entire, 1960s Hall of Fame, set like that, there's 25 cards, that I looked at. So I'm a Hall of Fame set registry guy. So my 60s Hall of Fame registry set, how much money did I make or lose? Well, if you had a PSA 6 set, you lost about $2,600 overall between 22 and 24, $4,400, as a 7 set, and then about $9,000 as an 8 set. Okay, so it's almost like doubling, every time. Now, if you look at just the percentage loss, the 8s actually held their own in PSA. The PSA 8s held their own, and the reason why, again, in my opinion, is set registry. There's more competition. And so that kind of props up those prices a little bit more than the 6 or 7 grade. Let's go over to SGC. SGC, $1,200 if you had a 6 set, $3,400 as a 7 set, and $10,000 as an 8 set, higher than PSA. This is where the registry doesn't help SGC, and the confidence maybe in those grades crossing over to PSA is lower. So therefore, the price gap, the price issue hurt them a lot more in 2024. Between 22 and 24, it lost more value. In fact, the 6s were much stronger in terms of holding the value. Then so it's almost like topsy turvy. In PSA, the 8s held value. SGC, the 6s held value. And I think a lot of that is, again, due to the fact that a lot of people that collect cards and SGC holders, or PSA collect kind of both, they don't see a lot of value difference between those two cards. And I do think SGC has a very strong fan base. And so people just were willing to pay a little bit more for the SGC card because, again, they view them as valuable as a PSA 6. So we didn't see the value loss like we saw in PSA. Again, the registry protects and creates sort of an artificial floor on those PSA 8s. So they're more protected in the collector community. And then the 7s are fairly similar. A little bit more of a loss in PSA than in SGC. So again, the story, even when you look at value loss, and if you look at the price gap, it's all about high end in PSA. The 7s and below, to me, SGC is starting to just close the gap. I think if I do this analysis in 26, I will, into this year, into next year, I will go predict that the gap between 8s will either be the same or wider, and 6s and 7s will continue to close the gap between PSA and SGC. So, in summary, if you're grading vintage cards, unless you're really confident that you're going to get an 8 or above, for a lot of these cards, even high-end Hall of Fame registry cards, you'd be just as likely to make money, the same amount of money on an SGC card as PSA. There could be a few points difference, but if that card's well centered and it grades well in SGC, the odds are that you're going to get very similar money. We see the 6s basically having no price gap, 7s is getting closer and closer. So there it is, guys. There is some good news, in my opinion, for people who love SGC cards. That price gap is closing on everything but 8s and above from what I'm seeing. On 60s cards, I use 60s cards because they're so available. Now, if I go back to pre-war and some other things, the story might be a little different. But right now, in something like is available as 60s Hall of Fame rookie cards, which sell every day on eBay, it does show that SGC is making a lot of good inroads. So let me know what you guys think. Let me know what kind of analysis you want me to do next time. And I'll see you on Cards and Comics. Bye.